recording. All right, so this session is part 2 of the required training for hiring committees, and we'll focus on EEO monitor skill building, behavioral question design, bias, power, and EDI rubrics. And EDI here is an acronym for Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. My name is Dr. Valencia Rafael. I go by Dr. VCR Woodward, and my pronouns are she, her, her. So let's go ahead and get started. So our workshop objectives are to develop skills to formulate behavioral interview questions, to identify and disrupt bias, to manage power dynamics, and to assemble EDI rubrics. So first, we'll do a quick recap of part 1. We'll talk about behavioral questions and how to put them together, different ways to intervene when bias shows up in the various parts of the hiring committee process, how to navigate power dynamics, and ways in which you can assemble equity, diversity, and inclusion rubrics. And with the time remaining, we'll answer some questions. So feel free to put them in the chat. I'll answer them as they come up to the extent I can, but otherwise I'll reserve answering the questions at the end. So let's start off with a recap of part 1. So we talked about why equity mindedness in hiring is important, and we went over some data and some different strategies. We talked about the EEO framework, so the various laws at the state and federal level, as well as your MSJC policy that prohibits discrimination in the hiring process. We talked about the various stages in the process and what tasks and outcomes are in each one. We briefly touched on implicit bias, what it is, and different ways that we can stop it from a systems level, and various resources either in the HR that have been developed by HR or that have been developed for you as just-in-time training resources as you move through the hiring process. So just a reminder, why we want to be equity minded is that this process is not only aligned with your strategy and your mission and the ways in which you engage teaching and learning for students, but it also benefits students and employees in their experience as a member of your MSJC community, but also it helps to retain both students and employees. And so just a reminder that these are the 5 tenets of being equity-minded. So using data by being evidence-based, and we want to make sure that we're reviewing disaggregated data. We're being race conscious, meaning that we are acknowledging that race exists, and we're also critical and reflective of color evasive ideology, which is another way of saying colorblindness. We're institutionally focused, and so we're reflective and proactive in the ways that our institutions might create barriers, whether they're intentional or not. We're also systemically aware, where we're critical of institutional structures that perpetuate bias. So we certainly want to engage in ways on the interpersonal level to treat everybody as if they matter, but also being mindful of the systems like policies, procedures, and processes that could be barriers or pose barriers for our students or employees. And finally, we want to be equity advancing. So we're willing to assess our own practice and be accountable to ourselves and others in closing equity gaps. And so how this translates in the hiring process, especially for you as EEO monitors and other leaders in the hiring process, is that we want to look for KSAs, so that's an acronym for knowledge, skills, and abilities, that are intrusive. So we want people who are proactive, and that can look like early alert systems or people who use early alert strategies. So for example, if a student has missed a couple classes or a couple appointments, there is outreach to that student to say, hey, I haven't heard from you. How are you doing? What can I do to help you? Or is there something that's getting in the way that you need resources for, right? And letting people know that the door is open. We also build relationships. And so definitely not seeing our students as just another dollar sign, right? But thinking about the ways in which our students are people. One example of this is getting to know people's names and pronouns. Using culturally relevant and affirming practices. So thinking about the ways in which we engage engage the diversity of our students, whether it's identity or experience, and infusing that into our everyday work practices or our teaching pedagogy. So for example, the text that we select for our syllabi, or the ways that we decorate our office to let students know that their lives matter and that we see them. Those are ways that we can definitely affirm students' culture as we work with them. We want to build community with and among students. And so right now in COVID, that gets a little bit difficult, but this could look like the ways in which we use Canvas or group chat or message boards or a campus app to continue ways to outreach and engage students and our coworkers. Using race-conscious strategies, so learning the ways in which microaggressions or micro inequities can show up and being mindful of how we can address them as a community. And finally, collecting, analyzing, and applying data. And I just want to give a shout out to your institutional research team. There's so much data available, and it's really easy to assess metrics and cut the data up in a lot of ways that are useful. And so I really want to commend your institutional research team for that, and encourage you that if you haven't had a chance to look into Power BI and use that dashboard, there's lots of data available. So using that data and asking candidates about how they use data in their work practices or in their past practices is a way to get at equity mindedness. So keep these in mind, because as we do some exercises later, we're going to be thinking about how do we assess equity mindedness in the hiring process. And these are some of the ways in which you can design questions around these strategies. So let's jump into behavioral questions. And here we're going to be asking about past behavior in order to predict future behavior or future performance. So first, what is a behavioral question? Well, these are questions about how candidates handled past situations in order to learn about their ability to perform in a future position. And so in some ways, folks that don't have a lot of experience may struggle here. And so you'll be able to discern who has actual experience versus who does not. But also folks that are particularly savvy, even if they haven't had a particular experience on point with the question, they should be able to provide you some transferable experience. So you're able to see, even if someone hasn't done this particular thing, they may have potential to perform the task or perform well in the position in the future. So it's a very useful strategy. So how to craft them. And so for many of you, if you've served on hiring committees before, this will look familiar. But essentially, there are three parts. The first part is a helpful lead-in. So it's an introduction. Then you have an open-ended beginning of a question. And then you describe the desired behavior you want the person to answer to. So here's an example. Our student population is about 52% Latinx, with 1 in 3 students identifying as first generation. Tell us about a time when you infused inclusive teaching strategies to students who may have similar identity or experience. So let's try this out. What are the first 3 words of the helpful lead-in? So go ahead and drop that in the chat. So we're looking for the helpful lead-in. What are the first 3 words? Okay, we've got some answers coming in. Lots of folks are agreeing that our student population are the first 3 words of the helpful lead-in. Okay, we're going to check our answers on the next slide. What about the next part, the open-ended beginning? What are the first 3 words of that section? Okay, so the answer is pouring in here. All right. And then what about the desired behavior? What are the first 3 words of the part that relate to the desired behavior? All right, so let's see how people did. So the first helpful lead-in is all of that yellow part. So our student population is about 52% Latinx, with 1 in 3 students identifying as first generation. So if you said our student population, gold star for you. And then the open-ended beginning is highlighted in green. So tell us about a time when. And then the desired behavior is infusing inclusive teaching strategies. So you infused inclusive would be the first 3 parts, but if you put inclusive teaching or anything related to that, then you were correct as well. So great work. And for those of you learning on demand, I imagine that you got this all correct as well. So this is a really easy formula to remember. Now, you don't have to have every question be a behavioral question, because some questions you might be able to ask directly about a technical skill or aspect. However, if you're looking to ensure that you have clear information about whether someone can perform a task, then I do encourage you to use behavioral interview questions and mix them out throughout your menu of questions that you're going to be asking. And typically this is for an interview. I know some places also might bring these up in a teaching demo. So after someone does a teaching demo, they may ask some follow-up questions to kind of get some context in terms of when they might use some of the strategies that they demonstrated in a teaching demo. So hopefully this is helpful for you. Feel free to return to this content if you are in the process of developing questions, because it certainly can be something that you reuse over and over again. Okay, so moving away from the example, let's see how you do with creating your own behavioral interview question. So think about this context where you're on a hiring committee for English faculty and you want to craft a question about serving students with home or food insecurity in order to be more successful in the classroom. So craft a behavioral question and post it in the chat box. And again, you're going to want to use those 3 parts: a helpful lead-in, an open-ended beginning, and a desired outcome or desired behavior. So take a minute to drop that in the chat. And if you're watching on demand, go ahead and pause the video here and try your hand at a behavioral interview question. Okay, let's see. Go ahead and paste your question in the chat box. We'll see if we can go through a couple examples from the group. All right, the questions are pouring in now. They're looking great. So I'll just pick a couple. So here's one. Many students have a food or housing insecurity. What steps have you taken to ensure students are aware of food and housing resources in the community? That's really great. So the helpful lead in here is saying many students have food, housing insecurity. And if your committee has access to data, you could even put how many of your students or how many people in your community have the food and housing insecurity. And then you have the health, then you have the open-ended, like what steps have you taken? And it's very specific because you're asking for particular steps. And then the desired behavior is to ensure that students are aware of food and housing resources. So that is great. So if your candidate has done their homework and you have food distribution, or you've been able to provide shelter options or resources, they'll be able to speak intelligently about how they would do that on your campus. But also if they've worked with the population of students that have had similar experiences, they'll be able to demonstrate how they contributed to that, whether it's putting it on their syllabus, whether it's making an announcement, posting it on their Canvas shell, or themselves volunteering for your food distribution, right? So there's lots of ways that people can demonstrate that. That's great. And I'll do one more. Describe how you would ensure your students are aware of support and services and available resources for food insecurity. So this is a really good start. So describe how you would ensure. So that would be a really good open-ended beginning. And then ensure your students are aware of support services is a really good desired behavior component. The only thing we would need to add here is the helpful lead-in. So again, if you had some data, if you talked about a specific issue on your campus, you would just want to add that helpful lead-in at the beginning. And sometimes people feel like this is kind of cheating or kind of tipping your hand, but really the helpful lead-in really only makes it easier for people who know what you're looking for. And then it also kind of calibrates or levels the stage for folks who may not be aware of an issue. So it helps balance the playing field for those folks who otherwise would have a really difficult answering the question. So the helpful lead-in really allows you to get better answers from all candidates. Thank you so much for participating, and hopefully that exercise was helpful. So again, just thinking about the ways in which KSAs can show up when you're putting together those questions, you can use these KSAs or this list, and a version of the PowerPoint will be available to you. So you can use this as a just-in-time guide when you're putting questions together. Think about these equity-mindedness KSAs, so that when you're putting questions together, you're asking about these various tenets. So I wanted to re-show that just so you know that this is a resource for you as you're drafting questions. So let's move on to bias mitigation tips and tricks. And here we're going to do a recap. I know some of you were at a recent training where we talked about this, but also talk about how do we apply the principles in bias mitigation and also some power dynamics, which we'll talk about next. So as a recap, active intervention strategies allow people to be empowered, and also it counters the bystander effect. So when we think about the bystander effect, the idea is that the more people are around, the less likely they are to intervene. And in group settings such as a hiring committee, there is ripeness for the bystander effect to show up because every committee member is thinking that somebody else will intervene. Luckily for you as an EEO monitor, it's your job to intervene, right? So people are going to be expecting you to intervene if something goes awry, or if the procedures aren't being followed, or if there's an issue. And the 5 Ds for intervention are as follows. And the 3 that are most popular is direct intervention, where you're addressing the behavior in the moment and right away and head on. To distract, so you could cause a distraction to shift attention away from an issue or to retrack a conversation. So for example, if you're having if things are getting kind of heated around one candidate, you could say, okay, we've talked about this candidate for a while, let's move on down the list, right? So you're just distracting and maneuvering the conversation away from the issue. You could delegate. So if you're the EEO monitor, this is a little bit difficult because you are the actual person that is knighted to do this work. But you also could bring in the chair if you're not the chair, or you can connect with HR if there's an issue, so you can assign responsibility to someone else to address the issue. You can also delay. It is an option available to you if in the moment it's not right. So for example, if you're about to end a meeting and it's just not right to address the issue right away, you could follow up at the next meeting that you're in, or follow up with HR after the fact. And you can also document. And you can use many of the strategies together, or mix and match. So you could be direct and address it, but you can also document it later. If there is an issue, you can document it. And at the close of the meeting, you can talk with HR. So you're delaying action, but you're also being able to follow up after the fact and using that documentation. So with those 5 Ds, there's a framework of how this plays out in the moment. So you want to spot the issue. So that's noticing. So you need to be aware and notice the situation. So you want to have your ears perked up, or being able to assess when issues are happening. So you want to be on the lookout. Then you want to identify your action options. So those are the 5 Ds, and you can apply those with some scripts that we'll go through in just a moment. But essentially, this is the assessment step. So you're assessing harm and options for your action. And you want to name the potential harm if no intervention occurs. So you want to assume personal responsibility and essentially sort of play out like, what happens if I don't step in? Sometimes that's helpful because you can say, okay, well, if I don't step in, then I can do something later. So sometimes it helps you to kind of run the scenario all the way through the end, just to help you assess what option is best for you. But regardless, you want to know that you're going to do something, and you want to assume that personal responsibility, because if everybody is assuming that everybody else is going to do something, the effect is that nobody does anything. You can talk through the options as the safest or most effective for the actor. So this is a self conversation that you're having in order to build your confidence to move forward. So I like to call this the muster step, because essentially you want to muster up what to do, or your know-how, and you want to build your confidence to execute the plan. So notice, assess, assume, and muster. So those people who are most likely to intervene have confidence and empowerment, and they get built up with a clear, realistic plan and practice. So the more that you think about what you might do beforehand, the more likely you're going to be able to execute an intervention strategy with success. And one thing to think about, and this has been a conversation that I've been having with several districts, is about calling in versus calling out. Because I think a lot of folks get stuck with speaking up when things are going not as planned, because they're worried that if they speak up, they'll be retaliated against, or they'll be shunned or shamed or vilified. And for you as EEO monitors, I think you might be in a more comfortable space because you actually have the task of intervening, right? So people won't be really thrown off by you speaking up because that's your role. But we all have personality barriers that may come up if we tend to be shy, or maybe it's our first time being an EEO monitor. It could be kind of tough. So I wanted to offer this piece, and it is by Loretta Ross, and it came out in the New York Times in 2019. But she talks about the difference between being called out and being called in, and she problematizes call out culture as toxic. But the interesting thing is that she's not saying that we shouldn't make call outs, but she's saying how we approach it should be very mindful. So paraphrasing her article, she says, call outs make people feel fearful of being targeted and shut down, but calling in is simply a call out done with love. It helps avoid the weaponization of suffering that prevents constructive healing. It engages in debates with words and actions of healing and restoration, and without the self-indulgence of drama. And so I really wanted to bring this and offer it to you to this presentation, because we can still point out behavior and bring it to our colleagues' attention. And we actually have to do that because, especially with bias, it's subconscious or it's unconscious, it's implicit. People may not be aware of what it is that they're doing or saying or what the impact is. So we actually have a responsibility and a duty to share that feedback. But we don't have to do it in a way that is aggressive or in a way that shuts conversation down. But if we can do it in a way that says, hey, we're all on the same page, we're on the same team, I want to bring something to your attention, how do we move forward together? That is a difference between a call in and a call out. So we want to be mindful of that when we're thinking about bystander intervention or active intervention strategies. So what does this look like in practice? So there are many ways in which bias can surface in a committee practice. I provided 10 examples of how I've seen it occur, and I'm curious if any of these resonate with you. So feel free to drop it in the chat if something feels familiar. But I've heard different bias statements like, we can't understand you, you're speaking too soft. I've heard microaggressions in committee deliberations, saying things like, we really want to make sure that we have a strong candidate. And is this woman really the strongest candidate, right? So it's implied that women aren't good at STEM or women aren't good in science when the questions of strength can come up, right? Because strength is a very masculine word. So it can be very subtle, but I've seen that happen as well. I've also heard people talk about attire. So she wasn't wearing professional clothes or they weren't wearing professional clothes, when really what we need to be focusing on is someone's ability to do their job, not their appearance. And then also making attributions or judgments about how someone appears, right? So saying they look too aloof or relaxed, they weren't engaged, they weren't smiling. Again, those things have nothing to do with a person's ability to do the job. It's really about how warm they are. But again, we're not there to assess, people's warmness. We're really there to assess whether they can do the job. I've also heard folks essentially avoid pronouncing people's names because it's, quote, too difficult. And that could really shut things down, and to an applicant themselves to say, oh, your name's too hard, I'm going to call you Mr. Q because I can't pronounce your full name. Other things like talking about how well-spoken a candidate is, or just saying, there's something about this person I really don't like, there's something off, where there's not an articulable reason. I've seen that come up as well. Or liking someone for a reason that is not in bounds for us to assess. So saying, oh, they went to the same college as me, or we had the same professor in grad school. And the ways that bias can kind of skew in a positive way is saying, well, that person is great. They seem to have their house, like a photo or a statue in their house in a background that resonated with you. And what they have in their background, again, does not relate to what it is that we're here to assess. So all of these could show up at any given time, or a version of these can show up at any given time. And so again, we want, as EEO monitors in particular, we want to be on the lookout for the ways in which bias can creep up and show up. We want to be able to decode them and use the 5 Ds. So some of the ways that we can do that, we need to be prepared to assess, what it is that we're going to say. How can we chime in? One of the ways that I like to do that is by asking a question. So a question can be as simple as, what do you mean by that? Because it doesn't necessarily put somebody on the spot and saying, that is inappropriate. We don't talk like that here, which you certainly could do if that is your style and it feels safe for you to do that. But sometimes people might like something more gentle, like a tap back instead of a pushback, as I call it, where they just say, what do you mean by that? And it gives a person an opportunity to pause and think and then reflect on what it is that they said. You also can ask a question to say, oh, thank you for sharing that. What skill and ability does that relate to? And this is particularly helpful in deliberation. So if someone, says, I couldn't understand that person. So if I couldn't understand them, then perhaps the students can't understand them. But really, that's about language diversity. So you could say, okay, thank you for sharing that. What knowledge, skill, and ability does that relate to? Now, you might have a conversation around clear communication, and people may try to use that standard to push someone that has language diversity out. But it's important to remember that our students and our employees, we need to be able to work with everyone, right? And work with diverse populations. So it actually might benefit us to have someone who speaks a different language as their first language as part of our community, so that we can engage and become more familiar with the different ways that all of us have of speaking, or the different languages that we speak. So I'm curious to hear what other ways that you might use to address these surface biases, whether it's a particular D that you would pick: distract, delegate, delay, etc., that you would use, and which number on this list feels most familiar to you. So if you could share that, which D would you match with the number most familiar with you in the chat, that would be really helpful for me to get a sense of the ways in which you might intervene if something like this comes up. So go ahead and drop that in the chat. So someone put in the chat that they would distract. So if you also would distract, which number would you probably use distract on the most? Go ahead and drop that in the chat. Someone had written another example of a way bias could show up as, they seem young. How could they have the experience that we're looking for? And that one really resonates for me, because I think, although those candidates over 40 are protected, folks that are under 40, they don't really have those protections, and their ability to perform might be questioned based on how young they look. So I appreciate that one. Okay, for number 8, someone would address it with a follow-up question. What do you mean by that? And answers usually appear with for number 1. And other folks had pointed out that 7 and 8 had stood out. And with number 6, name, I'm going to call him Mr. Q because I can't pronounce their name. They would document. So as you can see, just among yourselves, there's a lot of diversity and opportunity to use the various Ds available to you. And you can make your response according to your own style. So if questioning works with you, that is really helpful. Another tactic that I use is just say, and then I kind of pause, and then I kind of act naive and repeat what they said with an upward inflection. So for example, if for number 2, if someone says, oh, the person spoke too softly, and that could just be because they have like a vocal cord issue, or it could be their demeanor, but it doesn't mean that they're not qualified to do the job. It just might mean that once they start teaching or working, they may have to use a microphone, or we might have to provide another accommodation. But I could say something like, speaking too softly. And just by mirroring and raising my voice with an upward inflection, it again creates that opportunity for the person to pause and reflect and maybe correct what they said. So thank you for participating. I'm going to move us on to power dynamics. So just to kind of remind us of the ways in which power can show up, there's and this is based on some research with French and Raven talking about the 6 bases of power, plus one that I added, which is identity. And so power can show up in information. So some people may have more information than others. It could show up as coercion or intimidation, reward or resources. So if someone has the purse strings, they may have power, or particular identities that are considered to hold dominant in our society. We also can see this in positional power, which is usually in places that have hierarchies. And in colleges or in universities are definitely organizations that rely on a strategy of hierarchy. And finally, reference. So folks that have a lot of institutional knowledge or have been working for a while or just have an elderly presence. They're considered to hold power because people might be referential to them. So in all of these power plays, if you're looking at the grid here, across the columns, each type of power has a level of domination. So those are listed there. They might be charismatic, they might block access to information, make other people invisible, exploit their privilege, or if they have access to resources, they may bribe folks. And when we're navigating these politics or these powers, we know it exists. But across the columns, we have two choices. We can conform or play the game, or we contest or change the game. And in either situation, we have to be mindful of what feels most safe for us. And as EEO coordinators or EEO monitors, we have to figure out what is going to work best in this scenario. So I invite you to review the different ways in which power shows up. So that's on the left side there. And for some of you, the different types of power plays that you might use to resist. So one example I think that I do a lot is around people who block access to information. As someone who has recently started a job, I don't really know where to get all the information, especially because I started onboarding in COVID time. And so sometimes when I reach folks who I know have information, but they're not sharing it with me, or at least they're only letting it leak out a little bit at a time, I know that I can either work around that person and try to get to someone else who has that information, or I can demand transparency from that person. So you could see that one might be more confrontational than the other, but I at least have two options. And there's two options and more. I'm sure with additional time, you can come up with additional options to play the game or change the game. But just knowing that power dynamics are always happening in all of our hiring committees, and we need a framework and a way in which people can navigate them. So I offer this chart as some examples as EEO monitors in any given moment when you're starting to see these power plays show up either before, during, or after the hiring committee. There's a way in which these power dynamics can be navigated. So with that, I'm curious, are any of you more privy to play the game or to change the game as EEO monitors? Please put your answer in the chat. All right, lots of people saying change the game. And that's great, because the only way that we can really disrupt the power is to change the game, to switch it up. And it is a little bit more confrontational, but it's okay to play the game too, because I know that politics happens, and sometimes we need to play the game to get through it and then get to a level where we can change, but know that both are available to you. All right, so let's move on to EDI rubrics and how we can use them. So first, with rubrics, the benefits is that it could be any format of evaluative tool that you're using to assess candidates. So we do know that all of us are bringing different perspectives to the hiring committee. And so if we don't have a rubric, essentially what we're doing is we're using different information to assess the same thing. So with rubrics, it provides a structure for our own evaluation criteria, but also our evaluation criteria for a group. And it calibrates all of our expectations. It also helps to norm scoring. And this is twofold. So the act of creating a rubric as a group, that exercise in and of itself allows people to get on the same page. But then it also yields a product that you all can use as well. So rubrics are very helpful. And this also goes for using model answers. But they are tricky to develop and you might need some practice. So I've provided a couple samples. So this first sample is a rubric that I've used a version of it that I've used in my own hiring processes. And it's not necessarily for an equity, diversity, inclusion based question, but it's a question that many of you may have used. So what's been the toughest criticism you received so far in your career? From whom was the feedback and how did you respond? So on the left, we have a rating scale. So it goes from 0 to 3. No expertise, low expertise gets a 1, average expertise gets a 2, and high expertise gets a 3. And then in the other column, the explanation, we provided essentially some sample model answers, or at least some content we'd expect to be part of this part of the answer. So on the 0, for example, you have expresses lack of experience with receiving feedback or blames other for issues. So if someone were to provide an answer that kind of sounded like that, they would receive a 0. Versus on the level 3 high expertise, if the answer included a vivid narrative of feedback and the candidate's response to it, and it demonstrates a growth mindset or resiliency when receiving critical feedback, then they might earn a 3. And all of these explanations should be based on the job description itself and the articulation of what that job description means in practical application according to conversations that you're having with the hiring committee. So this is one example that I offer to you, but I want to show you an example related to equity, diversity, and inclusion in particular, because I think that one can be a little bit more tricky. So here we have a question. So sample question 8, please share how diversity, inclusion, or equity play a role in your approach to teaching and learning. And so while you can decide whether or not you're going to show some sort of graphic, in this case, we have a graphic below, and it's a color continuum of cultural competency. And I know it's a little hard to see, so I'm going to magnify this a little bit. So here you can see the continuum progresses from red to purple, and we have cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, cultural blindness, cultural pre-competence, cultural competence, and cultural proficiency. So in my particular hiring committee, we were looking for someone in blue and purple. And purple's really hard to be in all the time, but if there were glimpses of purple, that's great. But ideally, we want someone in the blue. And then we would rate the other items lower. So going back to the scale, on the rating scale, we go from 0 to 3 again, from no to high expertise, but we also mapped the particular place on the continuum with the question. So if someone gave an answer that reflected the red or orange, the cultural destructiveness or incapacity, they received a 0, whereas if someone gave an answer that reflected the blue or purple, they would get a 3, and in between, they would rate accordingly. And so this is just an example of how you can weave EDI into a rubric. And I know it can be difficult. So we definitely encourage you to take the time that a committee needs to break down how the rubrics are going to work for you. Because at the end of the day, they need to be usable for you and your committee. So the main tips with using rubrics, I recommend using the same working definitions. So in the case of the last example that I showed you, there was a particular framework that we were using. You don't have to use that framework, but whatever you use, make sure you all understand the same definition. It doesn't have to be from a textbook or literature, but essentially all of you have to be on the same page about what the words means that you're using or assessing. You should discuss model or desired answers, but they don't have to be very prescribed. You do want to leave room to be surprised, because you can have very rigid rubric, and then someone gives you a really amazing answer that you didn't even anticipate, but because it's not on the rubric, it's hard to score. So do be mindful that when you're putting rubrics together and you're assessing candidates, that you do leave room or leave some open language so that if you get a really amazing answer that is out of the box, you can score that as well. Communication is key. with rubric design. And you do want to make sure that you decide if you get something that doesn't quite fit in the rubric, but it should be scored, how you all are going to manage that once the rubric is designed, right? Because sometimes once you submit a question and submit it, you can't change it. So you definitely want to talk through that. So if you have any questions, do contact HR, because you want to make sure that they're aware if any concerns come up, or if there's confusion, or if the rubric just needs a little bit of work. So you definitely want to work with them. So again, with closing, I wanted to leave you with one of my favorite quotes: nothing will work unless you do. So as EEO monitors and leaders in this process, we do have a lot of responsibility, but hopefully after this training covering different practical tips related to question design, bias mitigation, power dynamics, and rubrics, you have more tools that you can use to fulfill your role. So with that, I want to thank you for your participation, and we'll go ahead and conclude our training here. And Heather, if you can stop the recording, I'll go ahead and take questions.